Think an old man with one arm deserves to stand with heroes? The young Marines sneer cut deep, like a cold wind through a Virginia hollow. Welcome to Soldier Miners, where we tell stories of honor carved in sacrifice, straight from the heart of small-town America. Meet John Callahan, a Marine who lost his arm in Helmand, but never as promised to a fallen brother, Danny Martinez. Betrayed by a new generation's scorn, he stands alone at Arlington's gates, clutching a handkerchief stitched with his daughter's name is Emily, gone too soon. Will his quiet courage bridge the divide between past and present, or will he fade like a forgotten hymn? From southern front porches to sacred battlegrounds, this tale of family, duty, and redemption will stir your soul. Subscribe now to join our journey. Hit that button and ring the bell, 'cause stories like these don't come around twice. Now, let's step into the summer of 2025, where a lone Marine faces a world that's forgotten how to salute. You think a one-armed old man in a thrift store uniform deserves to stand with heroes? The young corporal's voice sliced through the morning air, sharp and careless, his eyes barely lifting from the tablet in his hands. John Callahan stood frozen, the words landing like a grenade in the quiet of his chest. The sun was just rising over Arlington National Cemetery, June 2025, its light catching the endless rows of white headstones that stretched like silent sentinels across the Virginia hills. The breeze carried the faint cadence of a Marine band practicing somewhere beyond the iron gates, where a crowd was gathering for a ceremony to award the Medal of Honor to Colonel Danny Martinez, a man who died shielding a convoy in Afghanistan 4 years ago. Callahan, 68 years old, felt the weight of those words more than the ache in his bones or the phantom itch where his left arm used to be. He didn't flinch. He didn't answer. He just stood there, his old dress blues pressed but faded, the pinned-up sleeves swaying slightly in the wind. The corporal, Ryan Torres, was young, maybe 22, with a face still smooth and a posture that hadn't yet learned the cost of carrying a rifle through a war zone. His tone wasn't cruel, just indifferent, the kind of indifference that stings worse than malice. Callahan's eyes, gray and steady, traced the boy's name tag, then drifted past him to the ceremonial canopy in the distance. Flags rippled under the tent, their stars catching the light. Somewhere under that canopy was Danny's folded flag, waiting for its final moment. Callahan wasn't here for applause or a seat in the front row. He was here because 23 years ago, in a burning Humvee in Helmand, Danny had gripped his hand and whispered, "Don't let me be forgotten, John." That promise had anchored him through decades of silence, through the loss of his arm, through the loss of his daughter, Emily, whose name was stitched on the handkerchief pinned to his chest. The handkerchief was small, its blue thread uneven, the letters of Emily wobbly but deliberate, sewn by a 16-year-old girl in a hospital bed before leukemia stole her away in 2010. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't polished. But it was the only thing Callahan let touch his heart, the only piece of her he could still hold. He'd worn it today not as a badge, but as a reminder of her, of Danny, of the parts of himself that hadn't been buried with them. Torres's words echoed in his mind, each syllable a jab at the man he'd been and the man he still was. A one-armed old man, a thrift store uniform. The words didn't make him angry. They made him tired, the kind of tired that settles into your marrow after too many years of standing alone. He adjusted his stance, boots aligned, spine straight despite the dull throb in his lower back. The prosthetic hand in his pocket twitched, its metal joints cold against his fingers. He could feel the weight of the laminated ID card in his other pocket, its edges cracked, the photo inside showing a younger Callahan, 2 arms, a cocky grin, a Marine who thought he'd live forever. He'd carried it for decades, not for pride but for proof, a tether to the man who'd led his squad through hell and brought most of them home. He offered it now, pulling it out with a slow, deliberate motion, holding it toward Torres. "John Callahan," he said, voice low but steady, "served with Colonel Martinez." Hellmand, 2002. Torres barely glanced at the card. His eyes flicked to the handkerchief instead, a smirk tugging at his lips. That's not regulation, sir. Looks like something a kid made for a school project. A lance corporal standing nearby, barely older than a teenager, let out a muffled laugh, covering it with a cough. Callahan's hand paused, the ID still extended, but he didn't pull it back. He didn't look at the lance corporal. His gaze stayed on Torres, not accusing, not pleading, just waiting. The boy's smirk faded under that stare, and he shifted his weight, tapping at his tablet with a little too much force. Cards expired, Torres said, not meeting Callahan's eyes. This is a restricted event, Medal of Honor ceremony. You got an invite? Family relation to the deceased. No, Callahan said softly. I was a squad leader. Torres tapped the tablet again, scrolling through a digital guest list. The screen glowed, casting a faint blue light on his face. No Callahan here. Sorry, sir, no exceptions without clearance. He looked up, and for a moment, there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes, like he knew he'd crossed a line, but didn't know how to step back. Callahan nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, and slipped the ID back into his pocket. He stepped back from the gate, boots crunching on the gravel, and took up his post just outside the perimeter, facing the canopy. The breeze lifted the edge of his jacket, revealing the dull sheen of his prosthetic. He smoothed it down with his good hand, the motion automatic, practiced. He could hear the crowd inside, murmurs of dignitaries, the clink of medals on dress uniforms, the occasional burst of laughter from someone who didn't know what it cost to stand where they stood. A few passers-by glanced his way, an older woman in a black dress, a man in a suit with a press badge, a war correspondent named Clara Nguyen with a camera slung over her shoulder. Their eyes lingered, some with curiosity, some with pity, but none stopped. Clara adjusted her lens, pointed it toward Callahan, then turned away, focusing on the flags instead. He didn't mind. He wasn't here to be seen. Inside, the ceremony was starting to take shape. White chairs filled under the canopy, rows of them neat and orderly, like the headstones behind them. A Marine color guard moved in silence, their rifles gleaming as they rehearsed their steps. Callahan's eyes traced the path to the central platform where Danny's flag waited. He'd been to places like this before, not for colonels or medals, but for the others, the privates, the corporals, the ones whose names didn't make the news. Their funerals were quieter, the chairs half empty, the flags folded by hands that didn't know them. He'd stood for them, too, because someone had to. Because promises don't expire, even when ID cards do. The sun climbed higher, its warmth pressing against his face. He shifted his weight, the ache in his back sharpening, but he didn't sit. He didn't move. He stood as he'd been trained to stand, as he'd stood in the desert under a different sun when the world was fire and dust, and the only thing that mattered was the man next to you. He thought of Danny, not the colonel in the polished casket, but the skinny lieutenant who joked about bad MREs and promised to name his first kid after Callahan if they made it home. They'd made it home, but not whole. Danny had carried shrapnel scars. Callahan had carried a stump where his arm used to be. And Emily, she'd carried a disease that no amount of courage could fight. The handkerchief felt heavy against his chest, its stitches pressing into his skin. He didn't need to look at it to see her Emily, her hands trembling as she threaded the needle, her smile defiant even as the 4 dripped beside her. For you, Dad, she'd said, her voice thin but sure. So you don't forget me. As if he ever could. As if he hadn't spent every day since her death trying to live up to that smile, that name, that love. He pressed his hand against the handkerchief now, not to adjust it but to feel it, to anchor himself against the weight of Torres's words, the weight of being invisible in a place built on memory. A group of young Marines passed by, their voices loud, their steps careless. They tossed a water bottle between them, laughing about something on their phones. One of them glanced at Callahan, then away, like he was part of the scenery, a statue, a relic, not a man. Callahan didn't mind that either. He'd been a relic for years, a man out of time, carrying promises no one else remembered. But he stood anyway because Danny was waiting, because Emily was watching, because some things you do not because anyone sees, but because they're right. The first notes of the Star-Spangled Banner drifted from the canopy, faint but unmistakable. Callahan straightened, his good hand twitching as if to salute, but he held it still. The music was for the living, for the crowd inside, for the cameras and the speeches. Out here, at the edge of the gates, there was only silence, only memory, only a one-armed old man in a thrift store uniform, standing for a promise that refused to fade. The Star-Spangled Banner faded into the morning air, its final notes swallowed by the hum of the crowd under the ceremonial canopy at Arlington National Cemetery. June 2025 was warm, the sun climbing higher, casting sharp shadows across the gravel where John Callahan stood, just outside the iron gates. His old dress blues clung to his frame, the pinned-up left sleeve a quiet testament to a war that had taken more than it gave. The handkerchief pinned to his chest, embroidered with Emily in uneven blue thread, felt heavier now, as if his daughter's name carried the weight of the years since her death. Callahan, 68, stood with his boots aligned, his good hand resting on the prosthetic in his pocket, his eyes fixed on the distant platform where Colonel Daniel "Danny" Martinez's folded flag waited. He wasn't here for recognition. He was here because a promise made in the fire of Helmand 23 years ago still burned in his chest. Don't let me be forgotten, John. The ceremony had begun. From beyond the gates, Callahan could hear the muffled cadence of a Marine color guard, their boots striking the ground in perfect unison. The crowd inside, senators, officers, families, settled into white chairs, their murmurs blending with the occasional clink of metals on dress uniforms. A voice crackled through a microphone, welcoming the assembly to honor Colonel Martinez, a hero who died shielding a convoy in Afghanistan in 2021. Callahan's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't need speeches to remember Danny, the skinny lieutenant who'd shared his last pack of gum in the desert, who'd laughed through the fear, who'd gripped Callahan's hand as they crawled from a burning Humvee under Taliban fire. That Danny was why he stood here, ignored by the guards, invisible to the crowd, a relic in a world that had moved on. His back ached, a dull pulse that had grown familiar over decades. He shifted his weight, careful not to let his posture falter. The prosthetic hand, cold and unyielding, twitched in his pocket, a reminder of the ID that had taken his arm and nearly his life. He could still feel the phantom itch of fingers that weren't there, just as he could feel Emily's absence, sharp and constant. The handkerchief was her last gift, stitched in a hospital room where machines beeped and her smile defied the inevitable. "For you, Dad," she'd said, her voice a whisper, her hands trembling with the needle. He'd promised her, too, not with words, but with every breath since, that he'd carry her with him. That promise, like Danny's, was why he didn't walk away, why he stood under the weight of the young corporal's earlier words. "You think a one-armed old man in a thrift store uniform deserves to stand with heroes?" The words hadn't faded. They lingered, not as anger, but as a quiet ache, the kind that comes from being unseen in a place built on memory. Callahan's eyes traced the path to the canopy, where flags rippled in the breeze. He'd been to ceremonies like this before, for men whose names didn't make headlines, whose families sat in half-empty rows, whose flags were folded by strangers. He'd stood for them, too, because someone had to. Because honor wasn't a medal or a guest list. It was the choice to show up, even when no one noticed. The crowd inside grew quieter as a general began a speech, his voice steady, recounting Martinez's courage. Callahan couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. He knew Danny's story, not the polished version for the cameras, but the real one, written in sweat and blood and moments no one else remembered. He closed his eyes for a moment, the desert flashing behind his lids. Helmand, 2002, the Humvee engulfed in flames, Danny's face streaked with ash, his voice cracking. "You shouldn't have come back for me." Callahan had, because that's what Marines do. Because Emily, safe at home then, had written him a letter. "Don't leave anyone behind. Dad." He'd kept that letter until it fell apart, just as he kept her handkerchief now. A rustle nearby snapped him back to the present. A group of young Marines, off duty for a moment, sauntered past the gate, their voices loud, their steps loose. They tossed a water bottle between them, laughing about a video on one of their phones. The leader, Corporal Ryan Torres, was among them, his tablet now tucked under his arm. He spotted Callahan and slowed, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Yo, museum piece is still here," he said, loud enough for the others to hear. The group chuckled, their eyes flicking to Callahan's faded uniform, his pinned sleeve, the handkerchief that didn't belong. Callahan didn't move. His gaze stayed on the canopy, but he felt their stares, their laughter, like pebbles thrown against a wall he'd built long ago. Torres stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "What's that thing on your chest, old man?" he asked, pointing at the handkerchief. "Your lucky charm? Looks like it came from a craft fair." The others laughed again, one of them mimicking a sewing motion. Callahan's good hand tightened in his pocket, not in anger, but in reflex. The way you brace for a blow you know is coming. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Emily's name was sacred, not a punchline. Torres leaned in, undeterred. "Emily, huh? She your girlfriend?" The words were careless, tossed out like the water bottle, but they landed like shrapnel. The group laughed louder, the sound sharp in the quiet morning. Callahan's eyes met Torres's, not angry, not sad, just steady. The boy's smirk faltered, but he pressed on, reaching out with 2 fingers to brush the handkerchief, as if it were a joke, a prop in a costume. The fabric twitched under his touch. Callahan's hand rose not fast, not threatening, just enough to cover the name, to shield it. His prosthetic stayed in his pocket, but his good hand was firm, deliberate, a wall between Torres and the memory of his daughter. The laughter died. Torres stepped back, his face caught between defiance and unease. The other Marines shifted, their grins fading. A nearby officer, standing by the gate, glanced over, saw the exchange, and turned back to his clipboard as if nothing had happened. The silence was heavier than the laughter had been. Callahan lowered his hand, smoothing the handkerchief against his chest. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes returned to the canopy, where the ceremony continued, oblivious to the small drama at the gate. The officer's indifference stung, but it was familiar, a reminder that the world moved on, that heroes were honored inside while men like Callahan stood outside, carrying promises no one else remembered. He thought of Emily again, her voice in that hospital room, "You're my hero, Dad." He hadn't felt like one then, and he didn't now, but he stood anyway, because heroes don't choose their moments, they just show up. The group of Marines drifted away, their voices quieter now, their glances uneasy. Torres muttered something under his breath, and one of the others snorted, but the energy was gone. Callahan watched them go, then sat slowly on a low stone bench near the gate, his prosthetic clicking softly against the concrete. The ache in his back sharpened, but he ignored it. He reached for the handkerchief, unpinning it with care, his fingers trembling slightly not from age, but from the weight of what it held. He smoothed it flat in his lap, the blue stitches catching the sunlight. Each one was hers, each one a moment he'd never get back. He could still see her, her hair thin from chemo, her eyes bright with a courage he'd never matched. "Don't forget me," she'd said, and he hadn't. He never would. He folded the handkerchief once, twice, and pressed it against his chest, tucking it into his pocket, close to his heart. The gesture was private, sacred, a ritual no one else understood. From the canopy, the first rifle volley cracked the air, a sharp salute that made his spine straighten, even sitting down. The sound carried him back to Helmand, to the chaos of that day, the explosion, the fire, Danny's weight against his shoulder as he dragged him to safety. He'd lost his arm, but he'd saved his friend. Danny had lived to become a colonel, to save others, to earn the medal being presented now. Callahan had lived to carry the cost, to carry Emily's name, to stand here when no one else would. The ceremony continued, voices rising and falling, cameras clicking, flags snapping in the breeze. Callahan stood again, slowly, deliberately, his boots finding their place on the gravel. He didn't need to be inside to honor Danny. He didn't need a seat or a handshake. He needed only to be here, to keep the promise, to carry the weight of memory as he'd carried his squad, his daughter, his life. The sun pressed against his face, the ache in his back a steady pulse, but his eyes were clear, fixed on the canopy. He stood as if Emily were watching, as if Danny could see, as if the world might one day remember that honor isn't given, it's carried, stitch by stitch, step by step, through the silence no one else hears. The rifle volley's echo lingered in the air, a sharp crack that seemed to still the breeze at Arlington National Cemetery. June 2025 pressed its warmth against John Callahan's face as he stood just outside the iron gates, the gravel beneath his boots steadying him against the ache in his back. His old dress blues, faded but pressed, clung to his frame, the pinned-up left sleeve swaying slightly. The handkerchief embroidered with Emily, his daughter's name, rested in his chest pocket now, folded close to his heart after the young Marine's careless mockery. Callahan, 68, kept his eyes on the ceremonial canopy where Colonel Daniel "Danny" Martinez's folded flag gleamed under the sun. He wasn't here for a seat or a medal. He was here for a promise made 23 years ago in the fire of Hellmand. Don't let me be forgotten, John. That promise had carried him through loss, his arm, his daughter, his place in a world that no longer saw him, until this moment, when everything was about to change. The ceremony inside hummed with reverence. Speeches droned, cameras clicked, and dignitaries nodded under the canopy. Callahan stood alone, a sentinel at the edge of memory, his prosthetic hand cold in his pocket. The young corporal, Ryan Torres, and his group had drifted away after their taunts, their laughter silenced by Callahan's quiet dignity. But the sting of their words, museum peace, craft fair lingered, not as anger but as a weight, a reminder of how easily the past could be dismissed. He thought of Emily, her trembling hands stitching her name in that hospital room, her voice a whisper, "For you, Dad." He thought of Danny, his grin in the desert, his hand gripping Callahan's as they escaped death. Those memories were his medals, worn not on his chest but in his bones, and they were why he stood, even when no one noticed. A shadow moved near the gate, breaking his reverie. General Sarah Reynolds, her uniform crisp, a silver star pinned to her chest, stepped out from the command tent. Her face was lined with years, but sharp with purpose, the same intensity she'd had as a young lieutenant in Callahan's squad. She'd been there in Hellmand, 2002, when Callahan dragged Danny from the burning Humvee, when the ID took his arm. She'd seen it all, and now she saw him. Callahan straightened instinctively, his good hand twitching as if to salute, but he held it still. Reynolds didn't approach with ceremony. She walked with quiet urgency, her boots soft on the gravel, her eyes locking onto his. The crowd inside didn't notice. The cameras didn't turn. But Callahan felt the air shift, like the moment before a storm. "John Callahan," she said, her voice low, almost reverent. "Danny said you'd come." Callahan blinked, the breeze brushing his face. "Said I'd be here?" His voice was rough and used to being heard. Reynolds nodded, a faint smile softening her features. He wrote it in his will. If anyone was to carry his Medal of Honor to the memorial, it had to be you. She gestured to an aide, a young captain who stepped forward with a small velvet box, its surface catching the sunlight. The Medal of Honor, Danny's final honor, lay inside. Callahan's breath caught, a sharp tug in his chest. "I thought I was just here to watch," he said, almost to himself. Reynolds shook her head, her eyes glinting with something like gratitude. "You're why he made it to captain. Why I made it to general. Hellmand, you carried us both." The words landed like a salute, not the crisp kind from a parade ground, but the kind that comes from shared scars. Callahan looked at the box, its weight already pressing against his heart. He'd carried heavier things, Danny's limp body, Emily's fading hope, but this felt different, sacred. Reynolds placed the box in his hands, her touch steady, careful. It was heavier than he'd expected, like the promise he'd kept for 23 years. He looked up, searching her face, and saw not pity but respect, the kind that doesn't need words. "I'm not on the list," he said, a faint echo of the gate's rejection. Reynolds' smile tightened. "You're on his list. That's enough." She turned, gesturing toward the gate. "Walk with me, John." Not an order, not a request, but an invitation, the kind you give a brother. Callahan hesitated, the gravel anchoring him to the spot where he'd stood for hours unseen. Then he nodded, clutching the box, and stepped forward. Reynolds didn't lead or follow. She walked beside him, shoulder to shoulder, through the gate, across the grass, toward the heart of the ceremony. The crowd stirred, heads turning, whispers rippling like wind through the flags. The band fell silent, the general's speech pausing mid-sentence. Cameras swiveled, uncertain. Callahan felt their eyes, not as pity now, but as something else, curiosity, confusion, maybe awe. The young Marines, Torres and his group, stood near the path, their water bottle forgotten. They snapped to attention, their faces caught between shame and surprise. As Callahan passed, Torres stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Sir, I'm sorry." The words were small but heavy, carrying more than the taunts ever had. Callahan met his eyes, not angry, not forgiving, just steady. He nodded once, a gesture that closed the gap between them, and kept walking. Torres's shoulders slumped, but his eyes followed Callahan, wide with something like respect. The path to the memorial platform seemed longer than it was, each step a memory. Callahan saw Hellmand again. The fire, the dust, Danny's cracked voice. "You shouldn't have come back." He saw Emily, her smile in that sterile room, her needle threading hope into cloth. He carried them both now, not as burdens, but as strength, their names woven into every beat of his heart. The crowd was on its feet, a sea of uniforms and civilian suits, their silence louder than any applause. Veterans scattered among them stood taller. Some saluted, some clutched canes. One woman with gray hair in a dress uniform whispered, "Semper Fi." Callahan didn't look at them. His eyes were on the platform, where Danny's flag waited, where a marble pedestal stood empty, ready for the medal in his hands. He climbed the steps, Reynolds at his side, the box steady despite the tremble in his fingers. The platform was simple, the flag folded with precision, its stars bright against the blue. Callahan placed the velvet box beside it, his good hand lingering on the surface, his prosthetic still in his pocket. He removed his cover, tucking it under his arm, and rested his palm on the box. "I kept my word, Danny," he whispered, so soft only the wind could hear. The words were for his friend, not the crowd, not the cameras, not even Reynolds. They were the end of a promise, the closing of a circle begun in fire. The cantaps began, its notes slow and clear, sinking into the bones of every listener. Callahan stood straight, his eyes glistening not from tears, but from the weight of memory, from the sudden clarity of being seen. The crowd remained silent, their breaths held, as if the music carried them all. A veteran in civilian clothes, his cane shaking, stood without support. A woman in the back, her hands clasped, mouthed, "Welcome home." Callahan didn't see them, but he felt them, a quiet tide of recognition that he hadn't expected, hadn't sought, but couldn't deny. The ceremony ended with a final rifle salute, its echo fading into the hills. The chairs began to empty, the crowd dispersing, but Callahan lingered near the platform, his cover back on, his hand brushing the box one last time. Reynolds approached, her voice soft. "I know you didn't want recognition, John." He glanced down, his fingers grazing the handkerchief in his pocket. It was never about being seen. She nodded, her eyes warm. But some things deserve to be remembered. An hour later, as the last chairs were folded, a small group gathered near a cherry tree on the cemetery's edge. A bronze plaque had been placed at its base, its words simple but eternal, in honor of Sergeant John Callahan and Emily Callahan for courage carried, not conferred. Callahan knelt, his prosthetic clicking against the soil, and pulled the handkerchief from his pocket. He unfolded it one last time, its stitches catching the fading light, and buried it gently at the tree's roots. The act was silent, sacred, a final gift to Emily, to Danny, to the part of himself that had stood through the years. No one told him to do it. No one needed to. Reynolds stood nearby, her uniform a contrast to the soft green of the grass. "They'll come here, John," she said. Callahan rose, his eyes on the plaque, his voice steady. "They already are." He turned, his boots crunching on the gravel as he walked away, no speeches, no waves. The young Marines watched him go, their faces solemn, their laughter a distant memory. Clara Nguyen, the war correspondent, lowered her camera, her footage already spreading online, Callahan's story touching hearts across the country. The sun dipped lower, bathing the cemetery in muted gold. Callahan's shadow stretched long behind him, merging with the headstones, with the flags, with the promises that never fade. He didn't look back. Some men carry their honor in silence, and some legacies need no applause to endure. The rifle volley's echo lingered in the air, a sharp crack that seemed to still the breeze at Arlington National Cemetery. June 2025 pressed its warmth against John Callahan's face as he stood just outside the iron gates, the gravel beneath his boots steadying him against the ache in his back. His old dress blues, faded but pressed, clung to his frame, the pinned-up left sleeve swaying slightly. The handkerchief embroidered with Emily, his daughter's name, rested in his chest pocket now, folded close to his heart after the young Marine's careless mockery. Callahan, 68, kept his eyes on the ceremonial canopy, where Colonel Daniel "Danny" Martinez's folded flag gleamed under the sun. He wasn't here for a seat or a medal. He was here for a promise made 23 years ago in the fire of Helmand. "Don't let me be forgotten, John." That promise had carried him through loss, his arm, his daughter, his place in a world that no longer saw him, until this moment, when everything was about to change. The ceremony inside hummed with reverence. Speeches droned, cameras clicked, and dignitaries nodded under the canopy. Callahan stood alone, a sentinel at the edge of memory, his prosthetic hand cold in his pocket. The young corporal, Ryan Torres, and his group had drifted away after their taunts, their laughter silenced by Callahan's quiet dignity. But the sting of their words, museum piece, craft fair lingered, not as anger but as a weight, a reminder of how easily the past could be dismissed. He thought of Emily, her trembling hands stitching her name in that hospital room, her voice a whisper, "For you, Dad." He thought of Danny, his grin in the desert, his hand gripping Callahan's as they escaped death. Those memories were his medals, worn not on his chest but in his bones, and they were why he stood, even when no one noticed. A shadow moved near the gate, breaking his reverie. General Sarah Reynolds, her uniform crisp, a silver star pinned to her chest, stepped out from the command tent. Her face was lined with years, but sharp with purpose, the same intensity she'd had as a young lieutenant in Callahan's squad. She'd been there in Helmand, 2002, when Callahan dragged Danny from the burning Humvee, when the ID took his arm. She'd seen it all, and now she saw him. Callahan straightened instinctively, his good hand twitching as if to salute, but he held it still. Reynolds didn't approach with ceremony. She walked with quiet urgency, her boots soft on the gravel, her eyes locking onto his. The crowd inside didn't notice. The cameras didn't turn. But Callahan felt the air shift, like the moment before a storm. "John Callahan," she said, her voice low, almost reverent. "Danny said you'd come." Callahan blinked, the breeze brushing his face. "Said I'd be here?" His voice was rough and used to being heard. Reynolds nodded, a faint smile softening her features. He wrote it in his will. If anyone was to carry his Medal of Honor to the memorial, it had to be you. She gestured to an aide, a young captain who stepped forward with a small velvet box, its surface catching the sunlight. The Medal of Honor, Danny's final honor, lay inside. Callahan's breath caught, a sharp tug in his chest. "I thought I was just here to watch," he said, almost to himself. Reynolds shook her head, her eyes glinting with something like gratitude. "You're why he made it to captain. Why I made it to general. Hellmand, you carried us both." The words landed like a salute, not the crisp kind from a parade ground, but the kind that comes from shared scars. Callahan looked at the box, its weight already pressing against his heart. He'd carried heavier things, Danny's limp body, Emily's fading hope, but this felt different, sacred. Reynolds placed the box in his hands, her touch steady, careful. It was heavier than he'd expected, like the promise he'd kept for 23 years. He looked up, searching her face, and saw not pity but respect, the kind that doesn't need words. "I'm not on the list," he said, a faint echo of the gate's rejection. Reynolds's smile tightened. "You're on his list. That's enough." She turned, gesturing toward the gate. "Walk with me, John." Not an order, not a request, but an invitation, the kind you give a brother. Callahan hesitated, the gravel anchoring him to the spot where he'd stood for hours unseen. Then he nodded, clutching the box, and stepped forward. Reynolds didn't lead or follow. She walked beside him, shoulder to shoulder, through the gate, across the grass, toward the heart of the ceremony. The crowd stirred, heads turning, whispers rippling like wind through the flags. The band fell silent, the general's speech pausing mid-sentence. Cameras swiveled, uncertain. Callahan felt their eyes, not as pity now, but as something else, curiosity, confusion, maybe awe. The young Marines, Torres and his group, stood near the path, their water bottle forgotten. They snapped to attention, their faces caught between shame and surprise. As Callahan passed, Torres stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Sir, I'm sorry." The words were small but heavy, carrying more than the taunts ever had. Callahan met his eyes, not angry, not forgiving, just steady. He nodded once, a gesture that closed the gap between them, and kept walking. Torres's shoulders slumped, but his eyes followed Callahan, wide with something like respect. The path to the memorial platform seemed longer than it was, each step a memory. Callahan saw Hellmand again. The fire, the dust, Danny's cracked voice. "You shouldn't have come back." He saw Emily, her smile in that sterile room, her needle threading hope into cloth. He carried them both now, not as burdens, but as strength, their names woven into every beat of his heart. The crowd was on its feet, a sea of uniforms and civilian suits, their silence louder than any applause. Veterans scattered among them stood taller. Some saluted, some clutched canes. One woman with gray hair in a dress uniform whispered, "Semper Fi." Callahan didn't look at them. His eyes were on the platform where Danny's flag waited, where a marble pedestal stood empty, ready for the medal in his hands. He climbed the steps, Reynolds at his side, the box steady despite the tremble in his fingers. The platform was simple, the flag folded with precision, its stars bright against the blue. Callahan placed the velvet box beside it, his good hand lingering on the surface, his prosthetic still in his pocket. He removed his cover, tucking it under his arm, and rested his palm on the box. "I kept my word. Danny," he whispered, so soft only the wind could hear. The words were for his friend, not the crowd, not the cameras, not even Reynolds. They were the end of a promise, the closing of a circle begun in fire. The cantaps began, its notes slow and clear, sinking into the bones of every listener. Callahan stood straight, his eyes glistening not from tears, but from the weight of memory, from the sudden clarity of being seen. The crowd remained silent, their breaths held, as if the music carried them all. A veteran in civilian clothes, his cane shaking, stood without support. A woman in the back, her hands clasped, mouthed, "Welcome home." Callahan didn't see them, but he felt them, a quiet tide of recognition that he hadn't expected, hadn't sought, but couldn't deny. The ceremony ended with a final rifle salute, its echo fading into the hills. The chairs began to empty, the crowd dispersing, but Callahan lingered near the platform, his cover back on, his hand brushing the box one last time. Reynolds approached, her voice soft. "I know you didn't want recognition, John." He glanced down, his fingers grazing the handkerchief in his pocket. It was never about being seen. She nodded, her eyes warm. But some things deserve to be remembered. An hour later, as the last chairs were folded, a small group gathered near a cherry tree on the cemetery's edge. A bronze plaque had been placed at its base, its words simple but eternal, in honor of Sergeant John Callahan and Emily Callahan for courage carried, not conferred. Callahan knelt, his prosthetic clicking against the soil, and pulled the handkerchief from his pocket. He unfolded it one last time, its stitches catching the fading light, and buried it gently at the tree's roots. The act was silent, sacred, a final gift to Emily, to Danny, to the part of himself that had stood through the years. No one told him to do it. No one needed to. Reynolds stood nearby, her uniform a contrast to the soft green of the grass. "They'll come here, John," she said. Callahan rose, his eyes on the plaque, his voice steady. "They already are." He turned, his boots crunching on the gravel as he walked away, no speeches, no waves. The young Marines watched him go, their faces solemn, their laughter a distant memory. Clara Nguyen, the war correspondent, lowered her camera, her footage already spreading online. Callahan's story touching hearts across the country. The sun dipped lower, bathing the cemetery in muted gold. Callahan's shadow stretched long behind him, merging with the headstones, with the flags, with the promises that never fade. He didn't look back. Some men carry their honor in silence, and some legacies need no applause to endure. The cherry tree's leaves rustled softly in the late afternoon breeze, their shadows dancing across the bronze plaque at its base, in honor of Sergeant John Callahan and Emily Callahan for courage carried, not conferred. Arlington National Cemetery, June 2025, was quieter now, the chairs from the Medal of Honor ceremony folded and gone, the dignitaries and cameras dispersed. John Callahan, 68, stood alone by the tree, his old dress blues still pressed but heavy with the day's weight. His good hand brushed the plaque's edge, the cool metal grounding him against the ache in his back, the phantom itch where his left arm once was. The handkerchief embroidered with Emily, his daughter's name, was buried beneath the tree's roots, a silent offering to her memory, to Colonel Daniel "Danny" Martinez, to the promises he'd kept through decades of loss. He wasn't here for recognition. He was here because standing for those he loved was the only way he knew how to live. The sun dipped low, painting the cemetery in hues of gold and amber. Callahan's shadow stretched long, merging with the endless rows of white headstones, each one a story, a sacrifice, a name not forgotten. The ceremony earlier had changed something not in the world, but in him. General Sarah Reynolds' words still echoed, "You're why he made it to captain. Why I made it to general." The weight of the velvet box, Danny's Medal of Honor, still lingered in his hands, though he'd placed it beside the folded flag hours ago. The crowd's silence, the young corporal's apology, the veteran's salutes, they were moments he hadn't sought but couldn't unfeel. They pressed against his chest, not as pride but as a quiet ache, the kind that comes when you realize you've been seen, not just as a man, but as a promise kept. He adjusted his cover, the Marine Corps emblem catching the fading light. His prosthetic hand, cold in his pocket, twitched, a reminder of Hellman, 2002, when he dragged Danny from a burning Humvee, when the ID took his arm, but not his will. He thought of Emily, her smile in that hospital room, her needle threading hope into the handkerchief he'd buried. "Don't forget me, Dad," she'd said, and he hadn't. He never would. But today, for the first time in years, he felt something shift, a lightness, not relief, but peace, as if she and Danny were standing with him, their hands on his shoulders, whispering, "You can rest now." A soft crunch of gravel broke the silence. Corporal Ryan Torres approached, his uniform less crisped now, his face stripped of the smirk that had marked their earlier encounters. He stopped a few feet away, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the plaque. Callahan didn't turn, but he felt the boy's presence, the weight of his unspoken words. Torres cleared his throat, his voice low, almost lost in the breeze. "I looked you up, sir. Hellman 02. Silver Star. Never knew that." Callahan's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Never wore it," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Didn't need to." Torres shifted, his boots scuffing the ground. "What I said earlier about your uniform, about Emily, I was wrong. I didn't know." The words were raw, not rehearsed, carrying the weight of a young man confronting his own smallness. Callahan turned then, his gray eyes meeting Torres's, not judging, not forgiving, just seeing. He saw himself in the boy, decades ago, cocky and untested, before the desert taught him what words could cost. "You're here now," Callahan said simply. "That's what matters." Torres nodded, his jaw tight, and glanced at the plaque. "She was your daughter?" Callahan's hand brushed his chest, where the handkerchief had been. "Yeah, she was my world." Torres looked down, his voice barely a whisper. "I got a sister. She's 16. I get it now." The silence between them wasn't empty. It was a bridge, fragile but real, built on a single moment of understanding. Torres saluted, not the crisp drill of a parade, but the kind that comes from the heart, and walked away, his shadow trailing behind him. Callahan watched him go, then turned back to the tree. The cemetery was nearly empty now, save for a few stragglers, a groundskeeper sweeping the path, a woman placing flowers on a distant grave. But he wasn't alone. He felt them, Emily's laugh, Danny's grin, the men from his squad, whose names were carved in stone across these hills. They were with him, not as ghosts but as anchors, steadying him against the years. He'd carried them so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to share the weight. But today, the crowd's silence, Torres's apology, the plaque, they'd carried it with him, if only for a moment. A week later, Callahan sat in his small apartment in Fredericksburg, Virginia, the TV muted in the corner. The room was sparse, a worn couch, a coffee table with a stack of unopened bills, a framed photo of Emily on the wall, her smile frozen at 16. His dress blues hung in the closet, untouched since Arlington. He hadn't planned to watch the news, but Clara and Wen's footage had gone viral, shared across platforms from X to local stations. The Marine who stood outside, that's what they called him, a headline that made him wince. He didn't watch the clips, didn't read the comments, but he couldn't escape the letters that started arriving, handwritten, postmarked from places he'd never been. One was from a veteran in Ohio, a Vietnam medic who'd stood outside his own friend's funeral, uninvited, unseen. "You reminded me why we keep going," he wrote. Another was from a high school teacher in Texas whose students had watched the footage in class. "They're asking what honor means now," she said. A third was from Torres, short and scrawled, "Join the honor guard, sir. Learning to carry it right." Callahan read them in silence, his good hand trembling, not from age, but from the weight of being known. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. He folded the letters and placed them beside Emily's photo, a small altar to the life he'd lived. The story spread beyond the letters. The plaque at Arlington became a quiet pilgrimage site, not for crowds, but for those who understood, veterans, families, Marines who'd served in Afghanistan. They left coins, dog tags, folded notes at the cherry tree's base, each one a whisper of gratitude. A local paper ran a story, not about the ceremony, but about Callahan, the man who'd stood for a promise no one else remembered. The article quoted Reynolds. John Callahan didn't just carry a medal. He carried us all. Callahan didn't read it, but he heard about it from a neighbor, an old Marine who'd clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You did us proud, brother." He didn't feel proud. He felt finished, not in defeat, but in completion, as if the circle he'd been walking since Helmand had finally closed. He started visiting the local VA hospital, not as a patient, but as a volunteer, sitting with younger veterans, listening to their stories, Afghanistan, Iraq, places he'd never seen but understood. He didn't talk about Arlington, didn't mention the medal or the plaque, but they knew. They saw it in his eyes, in the way he listened, in the way he carried their pain as he'd carried Danny's, Emily's, his own. One kid, a former sniper with shaking hands, asked, "How do you keep going, sir?" Callahan thought of the handkerchief, buried now, its stitches part of the earth. "You carry what matters," he said, "even when it's heavy." Months later, on a crisp November morning, Callahan returned to Arlington for Veterans Day. The cherry tree was bare, its branches stark against the sky, but the plaque gleamed, surrounded by tokens, coins, a faded ribbon, a child's drawing of a Marine. He stood before it, his breath visible in the cold, his prosthetic hand steady in his pocket. A small group approached Torres, now in an honor guard uniform, leading a few young Marines. They didn't speak, just stood with him, their silence a salute. Reynolds was there, too, in civilian clothes, her silver star left at home. "They're still coming, John," she said, her voice soft. Callahan nodded, his eyes on the plaque. "They always will." He didn't stay long. He walked away, the gravel crunching under his boots, the cemetery stretching out around him, a sea of stories that would never fade. The letters, the plaque, the tree, they weren't his legacy. His legacy was the promise he'd kept, the love he'd carried, the honor he'd lived, stitch by stitch, step by step. He didn't look back. Some men don't need to be seen to be remembered, and some promises outlive the men who make them. The frost clung to the grass in Fredericksburg, Virginia, as John Callahan stepped out of his apartment, his breath visible in the early March 2026 air. The small town was waking slowly, its streets quiet under a gray dawn. At 69, Callahan moved with deliberate care, the ache in his back a constant companion, his prosthetic hand cold in his coat pocket. His dress blues hung untouched in the closet, replaced today by a worn jacket and a Marine Corps cap, its emblem faded but proud. He carried no medals, no handkerchief. Emily's name was buried beneath the cherry tree at Arlington, a silent anchor to his heart. But her memory and Danny Martinez's walked with him, their presence as real as the gravel crunching under his boots. He wasn't a hero, not in his own eyes. He was a man who'd kept promises, and now, months after the ceremony that had changed him, he was learning to carry something new, hope. The plaque at Arlington, inscribed in honor of Sergeant John Callahan and Emily Callahan for courage carried, not conferred, had become a quiet beacon. Veterans, families, even strangers left tokens at its base, coins, dog tags, letters folded against the wind. Callahan hadn't returned since Veterans Day, but he'd heard from others, a Marine who'd served with Danny, a widow whose husband's name was carved nearby, a kid who'd seen Clara when's viral footage and wanted to know what honor meant. The letters kept coming, too, stacked beside Emily's photo in his apartment, each one a thread connecting him to a world he'd thought had forgotten him. He didn't answer them, but he read every word, his good hand steady, his heart less heavy than it had been. Today, Callahan was headed to the VA hospital, where he'd been volunteering since the ceremony. He didn't talk about Arlington, didn't mention the Medal of Honor he'd carried for Danny, but the younger veterans knew. They saw it in the way he listened, the way he sat with them through their silences, their stories of Fallujah, Kandahar, places he hadn't fought but understood. He'd found a rhythm there, a purpose that felt like standing at the gate again, not for recognition, but for those who needed someone to show up. But this morning, as he walked the familiar path, a new challenge waited, one that would test the promises he'd kept and the man he'd become. At the hospital, the waiting room smelled of antiseptic and coffee, its fluorescent lights harsh against the gray morning. Callahan nodded to the receptionist, a retired Army nurse who called him Sarge, and made his way to the common area. A group of veterans sat in a loose circle, some in wheelchairs, others with canes, their faces a map of wars past and present. Among them was a new face, Lance Corporal Marcus Tate, 24, a Marine who'd lost both legs to an IED in Afghanistan in 2020. Tate's eyes were hollow, his hands restless, his voice sharp when he spoke. "What's the point of this?" he said, cutting through the group's quiet chatter. "Talking don't bring my legs back. Honor don't pay my bills." Callahan paused at the edge of the circle, his cap still on, his prosthetic hand twitching. He'd heard that tone before, not from Tate but from himself, years ago, when the hospital bed was his and Emily's diagnosis was new. He sat across from Tate, his gaze steady, not pushing, just present. "No," he said, his voice low, rough with years. "It don't, but it keeps you here." Tate scoffed, his jaw tight, but his eyes flickered, caught by something in Callahan's calm, something that refused to look away. Over the weeks, Callahan learned Tate's story not through questions, but through listening. Tate had been a rifleman, proud and fearless, until the explosion that took his legs and his squad's trust in the mission. He'd come home to a small town in Georgia, to a family that didn't know how to help, to a world that praised his sacrifice, but couldn't see his anger. "They call me a hero," Tate said one day, his wheelchair parked by a window, the frost outside blurring the world. "But I left my brothers behind." "What kind of hero does that?" Callahan didn't answer right away. He thought of Hellman, of Danny's voice, "You shouldn't have come back for me," and of the weight he'd carried since. "The kind that's still here," he said finally. "The kind that carries them." Tate's anger didn't fade, but his silences grew less hostile. Callahan didn't push, didn't preach. He shared small things, stories of his squad, the way Danny used to hum off-key to stay awake on patrol, the letter Emily wrote him in basic training, "Don't leave anyone behind. Dad." He didn't mention the handkerchief, but he felt it in his chest, buried but alive, its stitches part of him. Tate listened, his hands still, his eyes less hollow. One day he asked, "You ever feel like you failed them? The ones you couldn't save?" Callahan's throat tightened, Emily's smile flashing behind his eyes. "Every day," he said, "but failing ain't the same as giving up." The hospital wasn't the only place Callahan's presence lingered. Back in Fredericksburg, the local VFW post had started a scholarship in his and Emily's name, funded by donations sparked by Clara and Wen's footage. Callahan hadn't wanted it, but he'd gone to the first ceremony, standing in the back, his cap low, as a high school senior read her essay about what courage meant. "It's not about medals," she said, her voice clear. "It's about standing up, even when no one sees." Callahan's eyes had glistened, not from the words, but from the echo of Emily's courage, her needle threading hope in a hospital bed. He saw Corporal Ryan Torres again, too, at a Memorial Day event in May 2026. Torres, now a sergeant in the Honor Guard, stood taller, his uniform crisp, his eyes carrying a weight Callahan recognized. They didn't talk about Arlington, but Torres handed him a coin, a Marine Corps emblem etched on one side, Semper Fi on the other. "For you, sir," he said, his voice steady. "From the team." Callahan turned the coin in his good hand, its edges smooth, and nodded. "You're carrying it right," he said, and Torres's smile was small but real, a bridge between generations that hadn't existed a year ago. General Sarah Reynolds called once, her voice warm through the phone. "The tree's still drawing people, John," she said. "They're leaving letters for you now." Callahan didn't know what to say. He'd never been good with words, only with actions. "Tell them to write to Emily," he said finally. "She's the one who kept me going." Reynolds laughed softly, the sound of a friend, not a general. "They know, John. They know." The challenge with Tate came to a head in June, a year after the Arlington ceremony. The VA was hosting a small event for veterans' families, and Tate had refused to go. "My mom don't need to see me like this," he said, his wheelchair angled toward the window, his voice bitter. Callahan sat across from him, his cap on the table, his prosthetic hand resting openly now, no longer hidden. "She don't see the chair," he said. "She sees you." Tate shook his head, his hands clenched. "I ain't the son she raised. Not anymore." Callahan leaned forward, his voice low, steady. "You're the son she's waiting for. Don't leave her behind." The words hung between them, an echo of Emily's letter, of Danny's plea, of every promise Callahan had kept. Tate looked at him, his eyes wet, his anger cracking like ice under spring sun. "How do you do it?" he asked, his voice breaking. "How do you keep showing up?" Callahan thought of the cherry tree, the plaque, the letters, the moments when he'd wanted to stop, but didn't. "You carry what matters," he said, "even when it's heavy. Especially then." Tate went to the event, his mother's arms around him, her tears silent but fierce. Callahan stood in the back, his cap low, watching not as a hero, but as a man who'd learned to stand again. He didn't speak, didn't need to. Tate's mother caught his eye, her nod of thank you that carried more than words. Later, Tate gave him a dog tag, his name etched on one side, Hellman 20 on the other. "For you," he said, his voice steady now. Callahan took it, his good hand closing around it, and nodded. "Semper Fi," he said, and Tate's smile was the kind that comes from finding your way home. By summer's end, Callahan walked to the Fredericksburg Cemetery, where a small stone marked Emily's grave. He knelt, his prosthetic clicking against the earth, and placed the dog tag beside her name. "You're still teaching me, kid," he whispered, his voice thick. The breeze was warm, the sky clear, and for the first time, he felt not just peace but purpose, a new promise to carry not for himself, but for those still fighting to stand. He rose, his shadow long, his step steady, and walked into the light, knowing some promises don't end, they grow, like trees, like legacies, like love that never fades. The late November sky hung low over Arlington National Cemetery, its clouds heavy with the promise of snow. John Callahan, now 70, stood before the cherry tree, its bare branches stark against the gray, the bronze plaque at its base gleaming despite the dim light, in honor of Sergeant John Callahan and Emily Callahan, for courage carried, not conferred. The frost crunched under his boots, his warm Marine Corps cap shielding his eyes from the wind. His prosthetic hand rested in his coat pocket, cold but steady, while his good hand traced the plaque's letters, lingering on Emily's name. The handkerchief she'd stitched was buried here, a piece of his heart rooted in the earth, alongside the memory of Colonel Daniel "Danny" Martinez, whose Medal of Honor he'd carried 18 months ago. Callahan wasn't here for himself. He was here because promises don't fade, and because the world, in its quiet way, had started to remember. The plaque had become more than a marker. It was a sanctuary, drawing veterans, families, and strangers who left coins, dog tags, and letters folded against the elements. Callahan hadn't sought this, but he felt it, the weight of their stories, their gratitude, their need for something to hold onto. In Fredericksburg, his small apartment held a growing stack of letters, each one a voice from someone touched by Clara when's viral footage of that June 2025 ceremony. He'd read them all, from a Vietnam widow's thank you to a teenager's question, "How do you keep going when it hurts?" He didn't answer, but he carried their words, just as he carried Emily's smile, Danny's laugh, and the dog tag Marcus Tate had given him, now resting at Emily's grave. At the VA hospital, he'd found purpose, helping veterans like Tate find their way. But today, a new call had brought him back to Arlington, one that would test the man he'd become and the promises he still held. The cemetery was quiet, the headstones stretching like silent witnesses. Callahan had come at the request of General Sarah Reynolds, who'd called a week ago, her voice warm but urgent. "We're building something, John," she'd said. "A memorial garden around the tree. Your tree. We need you here." He'd hesitated. The idea of a garden public, permanent, feeling too big, too loud for a man who'd spent decades in silence. But Reynolds had insisted, and when she mentioned a name from his past, a name he hadn't heard in 24 years, he'd agreed. That name, Captain James Jimmy Larson, stirred a memory he'd buried, a wound he'd never let heal. Larson had been in his squad in Helmand, 2002, a young officer who'd frozen under fire the day the Humvee burned, the day Callahan lost his arm. Larson's hesitation had cost seconds, maybe lives, though Callahan had never blamed him. He dragged Larson to safety, too, but the captain had left the Marines soon after, carrying a guilt Callahan couldn't lift. Now Reynolds said, Larson was a civilian contractor leading the garden project, and he'd asked for Callahan, not as a figurehead, but as the man who'd saved him. The thought of facing Larson again, of unearthing that day, pressed against Callahan's chest, heavy as the frost on the ground. He heard footsteps, soft but deliberate, and turned to see Larson approaching. The man was older now, hair gray, face etched with lines, but his eyes were the same, haunted, searching. He wore a work jacket, a clipboard under his arm, no trace of the officer's swagger from decades ago. "John," Larson said, his voice catching. Callahan nodded, his good hand tightening in his pocket. "Jimmy." The silence between them wasn't empty. It was thick with Hellman's fire, with choices made and unmade, with years of carrying the same day in different ways. "I didn't think you'd come," Larson said, his eyes on the plaque. "After what I did or didn't do." Callahan looked at him, seeing not the officer who'd faltered, but the man who'd lived with it. "You're here now," he said, echoing the words he'd given Marcus Tate. "That's what counts." Larson's jaw tightened, his hands trembling slightly. "I left you there, John. You went back for Danny, for me, and I." I froze. I've been running from that ever since. Callahan's throat tightened, the memory sharp, flames, screams, the weight of Danny's body, Larson's wide eyes in the dust. He'd never spoken of it, not to Reynolds, not to Tate, not even to himself. But standing here under the cherry tree, he felt Emily's courage, Danny's trust, urging him forward. "We all freeze sometimes," he said, his voice low, steady. "What matters is you didn't stay frozen. You're building something now. That's not running." Larson looked at the tree, the plaque, the tokens left by strangers. "This is because of you," he said. "Not just the ceremony. The way you stood there, the way you still stand. It's why I came back." Callahan didn't answer, but his hand brushed the plaque, Emily's name grounding him. He didn't feel like a hero, but he felt seen, and that was enough to keep going. The garden project brought others, too. Sergeant Ryan Torres, now leading an honor guard unit, arrived with a team of young Marines, their shovels and saplings ready to shape the earth. Torres saluted Callahan, his face carrying a quiet pride. "We're planting for you, sir," he said, gesturing to the tree. "For Emily." Callahan nodded, the coin Torres had given him heavy in his pocket. Marcus Tate was there, too, his wheelchair navigating the gravel, his mother at his side. Tate's eyes were brighter now, his hands steady as he handed Callahan a small flag, its stars stitched by his sister. "For the garden," he said. "From us." Callahan took it, his good hand closing around it, and saw Emily and Tate's resolve in his mother's smile. The community gathered, veterans, locals, even Clara Gwynn, whose camera now captured not just a moment, but a movement. The garden took shape around the cherry tree, its paths lined with stones, each engraved with a name from Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam. Callahan worked alongside them, his prosthetic no longer hidden, his silence a steady presence. Larson shared plans, a bench for reflection, a wall for letters, but it was Callahan's quiet nods, his hands in the soil, that kept them moving. One evening, as the sun set, Larson handed him a letter, its paper-worn, its postmark from 2003. "I wrote it after Hellman," Larson said. "Never sent it. It's yours now." Callahan read it later, alone in his apartment, Emily's photo watching from the wall. Larson's words were raw, a confession of guilt, a thank you for the life Callahan had given him. "You carried me when I couldn't walk," he wrote. "I'm trying to carry something now because of you." Callahan folded the letter, his eyes glistening, and placed it with the others, a new thread in the tapestry of his life. By spring 2027, the garden was complete, its opening quiet but profound. Callahan stood at its heart, the cherry tree blooming pink, the plaque surrounded by stones and flags. Reynolds spoke, her voice carrying across the small crowd. "This is John Callahan's garden, not because he asked for it, but because he showed us how to stand." Callahan didn't speak, but he felt them: Emily, Danny, Larson, Tate, every name on every stone. He placed a new dog tag at the tree's base, his own this time, etched with Hellman 02. "For you," he whispered, to Emily, to Danny, to the man he'd been. He walked away, the crowd's murmurs fading, the cemetery stretching around him. Torres, Tate, and Larson watched him go, their shadows joined in the dusk. The garden would grow, its paths worn by those who came to remember, to heal, to stand. Callahan didn't look back. Some men carry their honor in silence, and some legacies bloom where promises are planted. The summer sun burned bright over Arlington National Cemetery, its rays weaving through the cherry tree's leaves, now lush and green in July 2027. John Callahan, 70, stood at the heart of the memorial garden, his boots steady on the stone path, his Marine Corps cap shielding his weathered face. The bronze plaque at the tree's base gleamed, in honor of Sergeant John Callahan and Emily Callahan for courage carried, not conferred. His prosthetic hand rested in his pocket, its cold metal of familiar weight, while his good hand brushed the dog tag he placed here months ago, etched with Hellman 02. The garden, born from his quiet stand 2 years prior, was alive, stones engraved with names, flags tucked into the earth, letters folded against time. Callahan wasn't here for himself. He was here for Emily, for Danny Martinez, for every name carved in his heart, their promises the flame that kept him moving. Today was different. The garden, once a quiet sanctuary, was the center of a national event, a dedication ceremony marking it as a permanent monument to veterans of modern wars. General Sarah Reynolds had called him weeks ago, her voice steady but insistent. "This is bigger than Arlington, John. The country's watching. They need you to speak." Callahan had resisted, his voice rough with doubt. "I'm no speaker, Sarah. I'm just a Marine." But Reynolds had pressed, and when she mentioned that Marcus Tate, Ryan Torres, and James Larson would be there, alongside a surprise she wouldn't name, he'd relented. Now, as the crowd gathered, veterans, families, reporters, even a senator or two, Callahan felt a weight heavier than the Medal of Honor he'd carried for Danny, heavier than the loss of his arm, heavier than Emily's absence. It was the weight of being seen, not as a relic, but as a man whose silence had sparked a fire. He stood by the tree, his faded jacket a contrast to the crisp uniforms around him. The garden was beautiful, paths winding through beds of wildflowers, benches carved with Semper Fi, a low wall holding letters from across the country. But Callahan's heart was uneasy. He'd spent decades carrying guilt for the men he couldn't save, for the father he hadn't been when Emily needed him most, for the years he'd hidden from the world. The letters in his apartment, the coins at the plaque, the stories of those he'd helped, they told him he'd done enough, but doubt lingered, sharp as the frost of that first Arlington day. And now to speak, To stand before thousands and name what he'd carried felt like baring his soul to a world that might not understand. The crowd swelled, their murmurs blending with the hum of a Marine band tuning nearby. Callahan's eyes scanned the faces: Marcus Tate, in his wheelchair, his mother at his side, his smile brighter than the day they'd met. Ryan Torres, now a staff sergeant, leading an honor guard, his posture proud. James Larson, his contractor's jacket traded for a suit, his eyes no longer haunted but clear. Clara Gwynn was there, her camera quiet, her presence a nod to the footage that had started it all. Reynolds stood by the podium, her silver star gleaming, her gaze warm as she caught Callahan's eye. He nodded, but his chest tightened. The words he'd rehearsed, simple, honest, feeling small against the moment. A new face emerged, a woman in her 40s, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes familiar in a way that stopped Callahan's breath. She approached, her steps hesitant, a dog tag dangling from her hand. "Sergeant Callahan," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm Laura Martinez, Danny's daughter." The name hit like a rifle shot, Hellman's fire flashing behind his eyes, Danny's grin, his plea, "Don't let me be forgotten." Callahan's hand shook, his prosthetic twitching. "Laura," he said, his voice barely audible. She held out the dog tag, etched with Martinez, D, Afghanistan 21. "Dad talked about you," she said, tears brimming. "He said you were the reason he came home to me." I needed to thank you." Callahan took the dog tag, his good hand closing around it, the metal warm from her touch. He saw Danny in her eyes, Emily in her tears, and something broke inside him, not pain, but release, a flood of memory and forgiveness. "He was my brother," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry I couldn't bring him home again." Laura shook her head, her hand finding his. "You did. Every day you stood, you brought him home." The crowd watched, silent, as she hugged him, her sobs soft against his shoulder. Callahan held her, his eyes glistening, the weight of decades lifting, if only for a moment. Reynolds stepped to the podium, her voice clear. "This garden is a testament to those who carry courage, not for glory, but for love. John Callahan showed us that." She gestured to him, and the crowd turned, their eyes a sea of gratitude. Callahan hesitated, his heart pounding, but Laura's hand squeezed his. Tate's nod urged him forward. Torres's salute steadied him. He walked to the podium, his boots slow on the stone, the dog tags, his, Danny's, clinking in his pocket. The microphone loomed, but he saw Emily's smile, felt Danny's grip, heard Tate's question, "How do you keep showing up?" "I'm no hero," he began, his voice rough but strong, cutting through the silence. "I'm a Marine who made promises. To my squad, to my daughter, Emily, to men like Danny Martinez who trusted me to carry them. I failed sometimes. I lost more than my arm in Hellman. I lost men I loved, years I can't get back, a daughter who deserved better. But promises don't die. They're the flame that keeps you going, even when it burns." His eyes found Laura, then Tate, then Torres, Larson, Reynolds. "This garden ain't mine. It's ours. It's for every name we carry, every letter we write, every step we take when we want to stop. It's for Emily, who taught me courage. For Danny, who taught me brotherhood. For all of you, who showed me I wasn't alone." The crowd was still, their breaths held, tears glinting in eyes young and old. Callahan's voice broke, but he pressed on. "I'm 70. I don't know how many steps I got left, but I'll carry you as long as I can. Because that's what Marines do. That's what families do. That's what we do." He stepped back, his hand brushing the dog tags, his eyes wet but clear. The silence shattered into applause, not loud but deep, a wave of love that wrapped around him like Emily's arms, Danny's laugh, the squad's voices in the desert. Torres's honor guard raised their rifles, a volley cracking the sky, each shot a heartbeat. The band played taps, its notes slow, piercing, sinking into the soul. Veterans stood, some saluting, some clutching hands over hearts. Tate's mother wept, her arm around her son. Larson placed a stone at the tree, his head bowed. Laura stood beside Callahan, her hand in his, her father's dog tag now joined with his own. Clara's camera clicked, not for fame but for memory, her lens catching the moment the world saw a man who'd stood for them all. As the crowd dispersed, Callahan lingered by the tree, the plaque glowing in the dusk. Reynolds approached, her voice soft. "You didn't just speak, John. You lit a fire." He shook his head, his hand on the dog tags. "I just told the truth." She smiled, a friend's smile, and handed him a letter, unsealed, from a child in California. "Dear Mr. Callahan, you made me want to be brave." He folded it, his eyes glistening, and tucked it with the others in his heart. That night in Fredericksburg, Callahan sat by Emily's grave, the dog tags resting beside her stone. "We did it, kid," he whispered, his voice thick. "You, me, Danny, we're still carrying them." The stars above were bright, the air warm, and for the first time he felt not just peace, not just purpose, but eternity, a flame that would burn beyond his steps, beyond his breath. He stood, his shadow long, and walked home, the garden's echo in his heart, knowing some promises don't just endure, they shine forever.